Hello and welcome to the Money Meets Mission podcast brought to you by AVPN Academy. I'm your host, Siddharth Chatterjee, and in this podcast series, we learn from leaders and experts to help us amplify our impact as practitioners in social investment. Our conversation today is with Amit Antony Alex, Investment Director at Dovetail Foundation, and it's about bringing stewardship from philosophy to practice in our grant making. We covered a lot of interesting ground here. We talked about the faith-based values that ground Dovetail's approach to stewardship and how the phrase love in action guides the foundation in its relationship to its grantees and its partners. Dovetail is an innovative and catalytic grantmaker in the truest sense. So it was then fascinating to learn why the foundation emphasizes unrestricted grantmaking, how they think about scalability and impact, and finally the concept of re-risking, a practice by which Dovetail Foundation pushes itself to be uncomfortable and take the grant-making risks that other funders avoid. This conversation changed my thinking about risk and what it means to be a good steward. I hope you enjoy it. Hi Amit, thank you so much for joining us today. It's fantastic to have you here. Could you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do at Dovetail Impact Foundation?
Thank you for this opportunity to be part of this podcast. Quickly to introduce myself, my name is Amit Antony Alex, and I work with Dovetail Impact Foundation as an investment director. My role within Dovetail is primarily to support our existing portfolio of organizations that we fund, along with identifying new prospect organizations that we want to bring on board into our portfolio. Dovetail Impact Foundation is a family foundation based out of Texas, US. We primarily provide grants to not-for-profits and do some impact investing. We look at specifically 4 areas from a sector point of view: healthcare, education, livelihood, and access to justice. And from a geographical point of view, our funding is spread across Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia.
Thanks so much. And we'll get to learn a lot more about how Dovetail works. But getting into our conversation today, which is about bringing stewardship from philosophy to practice.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot going on over there. But just to start off, is stewardship a core part of Dovetail's values or the ways that the organization operates and thinks about its grant making?
So stewardship is one of our core values, and it primarily comes from Dovetail Foundation being a Christian faith-based, value-aligned organization. For us, stewardship as an organization comes in 2 ways, I would say. One is as stewards of the blessings that has been provided to us. So in terms of the funds available, how we use it, making the right decisions, providing the right support to the organizations that we fund, being one part of it. And the second part of stewardship is what we call love in action. How do we steward relationship? This could be just the way we interact with our existing partners, prospect organizations, or peer funders. So this is how we think about stewardship, and it, end of the day, comes from Christian values that our principal holds, David Weekley, and that's been installed within the organization and how we work.
That's great. I think it's an interesting way of putting it, love in action, because another way we were framing this question earlier, which is how do you operationalize stewardship? And I think when we think about the idea of operationalizing things, it's about the tangible stuff. But part of practicing stewardship is practicing the intangibles, which is the culture, love in action. So what does it take to take this abstract, really important value, and how do you bring that into practice? Like, what are the approaches, techniques, part of the culture maybe, or just the way you do things that helps you bring stewardship into practice?
So one part of stewarding is we provide unrestricted funding. Most of our funding to our organizations is unrestricted. This comes from the point of view that organizations know best on how to utilize money we provide, right? The second part of stewardship for me is just the due diligence process. So we do quite a bit of in-depth due diligence while, potentially looking at an organization. A prospect organization that we want to bring on board. That's us taking a conscious effort in terms of making the right decisions. But even as part of renewal process, there is a in-depth conversation that we go with our existing partners in terms of what's the progress that they are making as well. So that's three things that I would classify into how we think about from a stewardship point of view. The love in action is the more intangible bit in terms of how do we operationalize it. Some examples is just ensuring that we communicate as clearly and transparently with existing partners as well as prospect organizations. If it's not a fit, trying to be as upfront as possible and say, hey, this is not going to go forward because of 1, 2, 3 reasons, right? If even an existing partner we feel is diverging in terms of a strategic plan, that's not aligned to us, being able to communicate that early on so that it doesn't come as a surprise, if we don't renew the next year. So small things like that is how we hope that we're bringing that stewardship and making it more tangible from a communication point of view as well.
Right. I think one thing that comes across in the way you talk about stewardship, and it also came across in our learning circle discussion we had earlier with a lot of other organizations, and the way they describe stewardship is an overarching perspective that the resources are not your own, and it's about using these resources in ways that benefit who it actually belongs to in the larger perspective, which might be the communities that we're working with or the world at large, the environment, nature. When you think about it that way, a completely different perspective for grant making, rather than thinking about this as, these are resources that we have to judiciously distribute, and there are resources we get credit for how we use them. And so I think the overarching perspective is very important, and it also comes across in the way you talk about unrestricted grant making, right? Which is that these organizations know best what they do and how they can be impactful. So I find that really interesting. And so even though it's challenging to talk about the specifics of the intangible love in action, but the overall perspective really comes across when it's something that's shared within the organization. It comes across in the little ways that you talked about. It brings into play a tension that on the surface there is between the idea of being a responsible steward and being a grant maker who is risk seeking or innovative, right? And I guess the theoretical tension is, if you're being responsible, then risk is something that you want to limit. But in practice, of course, maybe risk is very important to being a good steward. So I think there are two elements of risk that are really interesting from Dovetail's approach that I've heard from you before. One is unrestricted grant. The second one is betting on scalable models of impact. So let's get started by talking about the unrestricted grants. At AVPN, we're big advocates for trust-based philanthropy as a whole and unrestricted grant making. But a lot of grant makers are not comfortable with the idea of funding outside of a programmatic or a project focus for understandable reasons. But what is your philosophy around unrestricted grant making, and how has that become such a big part of how Dovetail works?
So it again goes back to that core value, and you touched on it, right? At Dovetail, we believe the blessings that we've received is from the Lord. Then the question is, how do we make the best use of it to elevate the suffering of the most needy, which is what philanthropic capital is expected to do. And that's the core fundamental reason that we do unrestricted funding. We want to ensure that the money is used in the most impactful way. You can ask any organization that's implementing, what they need the most. Their number one requirement would be unrestricted funding, right? And it gives them the freedom to innovate, take bigger risks, to do things that, they might not be otherwise beyond programmatic requirements, right? And again, that's the fundamental reason that we do unrestricted funding. It builds onto the trust-based philanthropic bit as well, right? Is the partner organizations that we work with, we trust them to the extent that we believe that they know how best to use the capital more than anything else.
Thanks for sharing. The second question is, what scalable models of impact? So that's something you talk about a lot when you're describing how you identify organizations to fund. What does scale mean in this context, and what does that look like?
It comes from just accepting that there is suffering in this world, right? And we see it wherever we are around us, and that there is suffering at scale, right? We believe in the redemptive value of this world, right? When we see that as well. And we believe that our capital should lead to creating as much impact as possible, hence the focus on scale. And at Dovetail, I say that there are two non-negotiables for us. One is scale and two is poverty focus when we look at any organization that we fund. What scale means for us, end of the day, is can an organization, one, reach as many people as possible from an impact perspective? Two is in terms of leverage. We're really interested to know per dollar of philanthropic money, how much is an organization able to leverage as well, be it government funding, be it funding from other sources, right? End of the day, the idea being that further amplifies impact. The third part for us when we look from a scale perspective is cost efficiencies. We see that happening in the for-profit world. As organizations grow bigger and bigger, they look at unit economics and efficiencies of scale. We want to be seeing that in the not-for-profit world with implementing organizations. So that's the three buckets I would use to define how we think about scale.
Yeah, and that really plays into the catalytic role that Dovetail has embraced in being able to create leverage out of the resources that you have. Probably that's also a reason that your focus has been on grant making, even though impact investing is also part of your approach.
I think it's similar. I think with impact investing, we might do one or two deals a year. We're interested in models in the for-profit impact investing space that, again, has very high leverage or can have catalytic levels of impact, which is impact first focus when it comes to, impact investing. But we know in the grant making, it's always impact first. Not-for-profits are sort of geared up to that. The way we look at it still remains the same. I think there's a higher level of scrutiny internally from an impact investing point of view, especially like what is the impact that a for-profit social enterprise can actually create and how catalytic can it be?
My final question before my final question is about faith-aligned funders in general. So stewardship is one of those core values that a lot of faith-aligned funders share. But in your experience from observing other funders and being part of Dovetail, are there some aspects, either the challenges that they face or the ways that they operate, that makes faith-aligned funders unique or distinguishes them from other philanthropists and impact investors?
Sure. I think the only piece that I would call out for faith-aligned funders is the need for higher level of accountability. End of the day, if you're faith-aligned, you come from a place where you believe that there is a greater power above you, therefore the need for greater accountability, right? And what that accountability means is a constant need to be tracking your impact as well, or how are you doing your work? And this is something we do with our portfolio, be it not-for-profit organizations. We want to look at outcome-based impact and for for-profit social enterprises, be it scale, be it impact, we want them to be tracking impact. And I think it's important as faith-aligned funders to be held to, at least internally, be held to a higher level of accountability. The other piece within that accountability is the need for constant self-reflection. Generally, we tend to have, as funders, a specific strategy, but being able to have a midline check-in to see if your strategy in terms of investing is working. As you look at new strategy, are there higher risks, end of the day, as philanthropic funders that you can take? Just to quote an example, within Dovetail, last year did an exercise where the term we used is re-risking, where we looked at where our philanthropic money was flowing into, models that we had gotten comfortable because they were less risky, geographies because peer funders were investing and we were co-investing in deals. So we looked at countries where poverty has been increasing over the last 5 years, where we know for a fact that there is lesser philanthropic money flowing in. So 11 countries, 10 of which is in Africa, along with Bangladesh, has been identified as focus countries, or what we call priority markets, in the next 2 years to identify scalable models that we could potentially fund. So again, it goes to sort of the accountability bit where I think it's important for faith-aligned funders to be, end of the day, accountable, but also taking higher risks.
Right. Love that example because I think it ties a few of the aspects together of what it looks like to practice good stewardship. And I think one of them is the intangible value. In this case, the value being criticality or accountability and self-reflection. Right? I think it's a really powerful way for Dovetail to continue to evolve. And then the element of risk, which we also discussed, and the idea that being innovative and trying to really push the ability of your resources to have an impact, that's such an important part of being a good steward. So risk is hugely important to being responsible in this case. That's a really fantastic model for the kind of philanthropic catalytic space, because you're right, this is the role of philanthropic givers in this space, is to be able to push the boundaries of what we're doing and to do the uncomfortable things, because if not the philanthropic givers, then who is going to take those risks and those leaps? Thank you so much, Amit. This has been a fascinating conversation. And to close, I'd love to hear if you have any final thoughts, maybe an example, but maybe an insight that you wanted to share for our community of social investment practitioners.
Sure. To funders, I think it's do more unrestricted funding. I'm pretty sure that's what grantee organizations want to hear and need end of the day. To implementing organizations, I would say, fundraising is tough. It is a non-stop process. But the important thing is to be trying to align yourself as much as possible to how a funder is thinking. And I think that's the key in ensuring fundraising becomes successful.
Thank you so much, Amit. It's been fantastic having you on, and I wish you a good day.
Thank you so much for having me.